On my bad days, the loneliness feels physical. Those are the words of Jen Ford, a 40-year-old clerical assistant who celebrated her 40th birthday alone in her apartment. She'd been recently interviewed by The Guardian about the impact of loneliness for those people in lockdown living alone. She told the newspaper that she'd never had much previous experience of loneliness, but now she feels it drilling into her bones. On her bad days, she said that she can barely open a can of beans because she feels all her energy is already consumed by just getting by. Jen is one of thousands of people who have been quoted in the articles about loneliness in lockdown, about the dramatic physical and mental downturn in the effects of it. But as a result, we are being sold an alarming narrative by the media that there is an epidemic, a virus, a silent killer in our midst that is more powerful and can kill more people than COVID-19. The former US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, famously said that the most common illness that he saw in his years of service was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness. Mother Teresa, she described loneliness as the greatest poverty, the leprosy of the modern world. As humans, our connections enable us to survive and thrive. And the most deepest human desire is to belong. There's something deeply ingrained in all of us that wants to have a shared identity, whether that's our shared identity of our nationality, our religious beliefs, our race and ethnicity, or our interests. Think, for example, how many of us love to go abroad to get away from it all, and yet we frequent our Irish pub. Or we start up a conversation with total strangers as soon as we hear the local accent. Think of people in sport, the football fans, how they love to express their shared identity by wearing their team's shirt. Did you know that Man United sold 3.25 million jerseys in the year 2018-19, the top team in the world? Often we just follow the habits of our ancestors without knowing, without thinking, without questioning. But there is definitely something deeply involved in us that wants to belong and wants to have a common identity with other people. Now COVID, social distancing and lockdown has really threatened our ability to connect, and it has upset our social norm. Our contact with friends and family, work colleagues, even strangers, has all been upset. You know, think back to your joyous moments, the heady experiences of going to sporting events, concerts, music festivals, the theatre. That can no longer happen. Think back to happy birthday. That used to mean that you were at a birthday party, not standing alone washing your hands. And even the absence of doing things for stopping for a cup of coffee whilst out shopping, or going into a cafe to work on your PC amongst strangers, even that, you know, it made us feel part of something bigger than ourselves. So totally out of the blue, now we are feeling like Jen Ford, and we are experiencing our first taste of loneliness, a bitter, most unexpected and unwanted side effect of the coronavirus pandemic. But what is meant by this word loneliness? Before 1830, loneliness and lonely rarely appeared in writing. In 1674, the naturalist John Ray compiled a glossary of infrequently used words, and he listed loneliness in that list. He defined it as a term that simply meant places and people far from neighbours. Around 1830, the time of the Industrial Revolution, there was a dramatic shift in language, and loneliness started to be regularly portrayed as a negative state of being. And by 1860, we were all introduced to probably the most famous lonely character, the doomed spinster in Charles Dickens' book, The Great Expectations. After that, there were many other lonely characters, including Mark David Caulfield. He was the lead character in J.D. Salinger's book, The Catcher in the Rye. He was blamed for inciting assassins, including Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon. And he was found at the scene of his arrest reading from the book. Fictional lonely characters, but there is nothing fictional about loneliness. The facts are that more than 3 in 5 Americans are lonely, according to a survey by Cigna Insurers. And whilst we often associate loneliness with old age, a YouGov survey revealed that millennials, that is the social media generation, are in fact the one that feels the most lonely, with 1 in 3 saying that they are often or always lonely. The Office of National Statistics in May 2020 revealed that 5% of the British residents, 2.6 million people, were chronically lonely. Shockingly, in November 20, that figure has risen to 8%, 4.2 million. Communities have changed. Gone are the days of nipping around to the neighbour to borrow a cup of sugar. And I can fondly remember the open doors in our neighbourhood. People would just call in, uninvited, unannounced, and they were always welcomed with a cup of tea and the homemade bread. We used to call it tequila. It's a commonly known Irish term. But sadly today, 73% of UK residents don't know their neighbours' names. But enough doom and gloom. The theme today of TEDxCookstown is, what if? So what if loneliness was good? Pre-1800, when people were described as lonely, it simply meant that they were in a state of oneliness and solitude, from the Latin word solus, meaning alone. Being lonely did not imply any emotional lack. In fact, it was a positive word, a time when people could reflect and discover who they really were. It had holy connotations. Jesus was often lonely and contemplative. And solitude was often associated with intellectual breakthroughs and great moments of creativity. In 1606, Shakespeare was actually in quarantine from the bubonic plague, and at the time where, just like now, all the theatres were closed, and he wrote 3 of his greatest works, King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. In 1687, Newton sat lonely under a tree, and he discovered gravity. In 1804, Wordsworth wandered lonely as a cloud, resulting in his best-known work. And in 1928, Alexander Fleming, the lonely researcher, discovered penicillin and changed the course of medicine. In September 2019, before COVID was born, the historian Dr. Faye Bound Alberti, she published a biography of loneliness, the history of an emotion. She says we tend to think of lonely people just needing and waiting for others to reach out and to help and support them and to make them feel less lonely. But she does say that this is an injustice to the different types of emotions involved. Loneliness is complex. Some people feel lonely despite being surrounded by extensive networks, and others may not, even if they live alone. Often lonely people don't necessarily want company. And even those that do, they certainly don't want just anybody. Having owned a matchmaking company, I can certainly vouch for that. Many people simply like being alone, using the time to be creative or to study. And I'm sure there are so many others like me who some days just want to run away to be on their own. Whilst I in no way wish to belittle anyone suffering from chronic loneliness, I firmly believe that in this age of COVID, the last thing that people need to be told is that being alone means that they are in danger of falling victim to another epidemic. Reading and hearing continuous negative narrative about loneliness drills into the mind, and if it isn't halted, will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We had circuit breaker lockdowns. We now need circuit breakers on loneliness. We need investment in new education to raise awareness and understanding of the positive power of the mind, how to apply that science and to disrupt and counteract negativity, something that we were never taught in schools. Most importantly, the media must stop this overwhelming barrage of negative language and loneliness, which serves no purpose whatsoever other than to increase people's anxiety and their feelings of helplessness, conditioning them into depression. Instead, the media must help to influence people to embrace the idea that this is a rare opportunity to be alone in the positive sense of the word, just like the pre-1800s. As Mandy Hale said, a season of loneliness and isolation is when the caterpillar gets its wings. It will take time. I personally can say that as a former bank manager, I discovered that I was institutionalized over those 35 years. I never even realized that I was creative. It took a while to uncover it and unearth it and decide to go self-employed, to utilize my innate ability to connect people. During lockdown, I too had time to sit in lonely contemplation, to contemplate loneliness. And I wondered, how can we keep connected whilst being apart? What if this period of solitude was an opportunity to do things differently and transform the way we deliver connectiveness forever? What if people from across the world could come together to share interests, learn new things, or simply to be entertained? What if loneliness could be tackled and we could provide a support structure and a sense of belonging for people like Jen Ford? Whilst I continue to further develop my ideas to bring the answers to these questions to life, much more needs to be done to change societal attitudes and perceptions of loneliness. People fearing for their jobs and families, businesses facing closure, people without internet access, children going without subsidised meals during school holidays should be regarded as the truly lonely. The world's governments need a period of lonely contemplation to restore their 2020 vision and foresight. The best thing that could come out of lockdown would be the total re-evaluation and recreation of how our society is structured. What if this were to happen? It would make loneliness a force for good.